Hi there, my name is Alex. This is the story of how my life changed forever. I grew up in a small town. My family didn't have much money, and we lived in a tiny, old house. Things were hard. We didn't have enough money for many things. Sometimes, I didn't even know where my next meal would come from. We didn't talk much. In my family, everyone was busy, trying to survive. My parents worked long hours. But it wasn't enough. I was just another kid, struggling to get by, doing my best to stay out of trouble. I didn't have many friends, and I often felt very alone. But one day, something happened that changed everything. It wasn't a big thing at first. In fact, it was quite small, but this small thing set me on a new path. It was the day I met Mrs. Johnson. At that time, I didn't go to school regularly. My family didn't think school was important. Instead, I would walk around town, trying to find small jobs to help out. It wasn't an easy life. I wasn't like the other kids. They had families who looked out for them. I felt like no one really cared about me. One day, I was sitting on a bench in the park. I was tired, hungry, and feeling lost. I wondered what my future would be like. Would I always be poor? Would I ever find my place in the world? I didn't know. Then, out of nowhere, a woman passed by. She looked at me and smiled. I was surprised. Most people didn't even notice me, but this woman did. Her name was Mrs. Johnson, and that smile would change my life forever. Mrs. Johnson didn't just smile. She stopped and started talking to me. At first, I wasn't sure why. No one ever really talked to me, but there was something kind about her. She asked me my name, and I told her, Alex. She asked where I was from, and I told her about my small town and my family. She looked concerned when I told her I wasn't going to school. She asked me why, and I explained that my family couldn't afford to send me. I didn't think much about it at the time. It was just the way my life was. But then she did something surprising. She invited me to have dinner with her and her family. I was shocked. No one had ever invited me into their home before. I didn't know what to say. At first, I wanted to say no, but I was hungry, and Mrs. Johnson seemed kind, so I said yes. That evening, I went to Mrs. Johnson's house. It was much bigger than the house I grew up in. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something different. It was warm and welcoming. I could hear the sound of laughter and smell food cooking in the kitchen. We sat down at the dinner table. There was so much food, more than I had ever seen before. Mrs. Johnson's family made me feel welcome. They didn't treat me like I was a stranger. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel invisible. I felt like I belonged. After dinner, we talked some more. I told them about my life, about the struggles I faced, and they listened. They really listened. It felt good to have someone care about me. Then, something happened that I never expected. Mrs. Johnson asked me if I wanted to stay with them. I was speechless. Why would they want me to stay? I was just a kid from the streets. But Mrs. Johnson and her family saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. She said they could help me go back to school. She told me that I didn't have to be alone anymore. I didn't know what to say. It was like a dream, but this dream was real. I agreed to stay that night as I lay in a warm bed. For the first time in ages, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The next week, Mrs. Johnson took me to a new school. I was nervous. I hadn't been to school in a long time. I was afraid I wouldn't fit in, or the other kids would make fun of me. But Mrs. Johnson assured me that everything would be okay. School was tough at first. I was far behind the other kids, while they knew how to read and write well. I struggled. There were many times I wanted to give up, but every day after school, Mrs. Johnson would sit with me and help me with my homework. Little by little, I started to improve. It wasn't easy. I had a lot to catch up on, but Mrs. Johnson never let me give up. She believed in me, and because of that, I started to believe in myself. As time passed, I became more and more a part of Mrs. Johnson's family. They didn't just treat me like a guest. They treated me like one of their own. Mr. Johnson would take me to play soccer on weekends, and Mrs. Johnson always made sure I had what I needed for school. I began to feel like I was part of something bigger, like I belonged. This family gave me something I had never had before, love and support. For the first time, I started to believe that maybe my life could be different. Maybe I could have a future. But life wasn't always easy. Even though I was doing better in school, there were still days when I felt like I didn't belong. The other kids at school came from rich families. They had nice clothes and big houses. I was different, and sometimes that made me feel like I didn't fit in. One day, I failed a big test. I was so upset. I thought Mrs. Johnson would be disappointed in me. I didn't want to let her down. I didn't want to be a failure. But when I told her, she didn't get angry. She sat down next to me and said, "It's okay to fail, Alex. What matters is that you keep trying." Her words stuck with me. I realized that I didn't have to be perfect. I just had to keep trying. I didn't have to give up. Mrs. Johnson's support gave me the strength to keep going. I started to study harder. I asked for help when I needed it. Slowly, I started to get better at school. My grades improved, and I started to feel more confident. I wasn't the same scared boy who used to walk the streets, wondering what his future would be like. I was someone with a family, someone who believed in himself, and that made all the difference. As I grew older, I started to dream about the future. I had never thought about what I wanted to do with my life before, but now I had dreams. I wanted to go to college. I wanted to make something of myself. I wanted to make Mrs. Johnson proud. I worked hard every day. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had faced tough times before, and I knew I could overcome anything. Finally, the day came when I graduated from high school. I couldn't believe it. I had come so far. As I stood on that stage, holding my diploma, I looked out into the crowd and saw Mrs. Johnson and her family. They were smiling and cheering for me. I realized then that I wasn't just graduating from school. I was graduating into a new life. A life filled with hope, dreams, and possibilities. Looking back now, I realize how lucky I was to meet Mrs. Johnson. She didn't have to stop and talk to me that day in the park, but she did. Her small act of kindness changed my entire life. It gave me a chance to be something more, to dream bigger. I learned that kindness can change the world. Mrs. Johnson's smile changed my world. And now I want to do the same for others. I want to help people the way she helped me. Even though my story has a happy ending, I know the journey isn't over. Life will continue to throw challenges my way. But now I feel ready. I know that with hard work and the support of people who care, I can face anything. I hope my story inspires you. Maybe you feel lost right now or unsure of your future. But remember, life can change when you least expect it. Don't give up. Keep believing in yourself. You never know when a small act of kindness will change everything. So, what's the lesson? It's simple. Kindness matters. You don't need to be rich or powerful to make a difference in someone's life. You just need to care. Mrs. Johnson's kindness gave me a new life, and now I want to pass that on to others. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel.